Thanks for joining us. I'm Megan Roberts. As Canada's Western premiers gather in Yellowknife for their annual two-day conference, they are being met by protesters. The Dene Nation has organized what it calls a peaceful gathering to take a stand against Alberta separatism. The separatist Alberta Prosperity Project is gunning for a referendum on the matter, and Danielle Smith is among the premiers at this week's meetings. Some First Nations are worried about what separatism could mean for treaty rights. The Dene Nation says today's rally is to affirm their treaty agreements and support Indigenous sovereignty. The CBC's Natalie Pressman is live at the Northwest Territories Legislature with more. Natalie, tell us what's happening there.
That's right, Megan. I'm in front of the legislature here, where as you can see behind me, there's a crowd of probably about 30 or so people gathered here for this rally that Dene Nation is putting on. It's about affirming treaty rights, as you said, against Alberta separation. And there's speeches happening right now about, you hear some clapping, the crowd liking what they're hearing. There's a bit of drumming. It's all about One Canada. And, there's a sign that says, "Our treaties don't end where your Alberta begins." There's signs that say water is life. And it's just this message of unity that they're hoping to send to Alberta and stand strong with the First Nations who have opposed this sort of growing movement of Alberta separation. And, this is something that came up in the NWT legislature earlier today, where the Premier was asked if there is a plan and if the Northwest Territories is preparing for the possibility of Alberta separation. The Premier said that, he won't necessarily speculate on a hypothetical, but that if services that Northwest Territories residents rely on Alberta for, like healthcare, start to become unavailable, that the Northwest Territories would create partnerships with other jurisdictions and make sure that residents do have those services that they need. And Megan, there's another rally that's going to be getting underway here momentarily on that topic. The Northern Mosaic Network is putting on a rally to raise awareness about trans healthcare and gender-affirming care, access that Northwest Territories residents have to that care in Alberta. And that should be going on until about 7 p.m. here, Megan.
Okay, thank you so much, Natalie. That is the CBC's Natalie Pressman, live from the NWT legislature tonight. Now, as that protest gears up outside, questions on the same topic were brought up inside the NWT legislature about healthcare for trans folks in the NWT. The Alberta law at the center of all of this would ban doctors from providing gender-affirming treatment like puberty blockers and hormone therapy for those under 16. As you heard from Natalie, it's causing concern in the Northwest Territories, which relies on its southern neighbor for certain kinds of healthcare. In the Legislative Assembly, one MLA asked what's being done to ensure trans folks in the NWT have care. Here's part of that exchange.
Over 1 year ago, just a few months after Alberta's government announced proposed changes to gender-affirming care, Northern Mosaic Network reached out to Minister Semler to get answers to questions that community members shared with that organization about how their access to gender-affirming care would be impacted. So, Mr. Speaker, can the minister explain what actions she has taken since then to address the concerns of our two LGBTQI plus community members on access to safe healthcare out of territory?
First, I want to assure NWT residents that healthcare services for transgender individuals, including children and youth, will continue to be available within our health system. If the Northwest Territories clinical experts in transgender care cannot meet the needs of the residents, a referral can be made to an out-of-territory practitioner. Steps I've taken is to ensure that concrete steps to safeguard access for NWT residents are put in place. I've directed my department to secure alternate out-of-territory care pathways for these individuals, meaning when a service is not available to a Northwest Territories residents in Northwest Territories or Alberta, physicians will refer patients to a jurisdiction where they may continue to receive the care they need. Thank you, Mr.
The Alberta law is currently being challenged in court. The The legislation received royal assent in December, but it hasn't been proclaimed. That means it's not in effect just yet. The Western premiers have lots to talk about this week. Trade, natural resources, and Arctic sovereignty are all on the table. But as the CBC's Katie DeRosa tells us, Alberta separatism will also likely feature in a big way.
It's really unfortunate that at this moment, when Western Canada is stepping into the spotlight, that there's any discussion at all about leaving Canada.
As BC's Premier heads to Yellowknife on Wednesday for the Western Premiers Conference, he's disappointed that the issue of Western separatism hangs over it like a dark cloud.
To advance that at this moment, it's strange.
Critics argue Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has fanned the flames of separatism with a new law that lowers the threshold for holding a referendum. Groups in favor of an independent Alberta are already laying the groundwork for a vote. Alberta's opposition leader is slamming Danielle Smith for legitimizing the issue.
I sure hope that Premier Eby and Premier Canoe at this Western meeting will just say to her, quit it. This is unhelpful for all of us, and we're getting lumped in with you.
Nahid Nenshi says it's possible to have a conversation about Alberta's natural resource sector without threatening national unity. The BC Business Council is part of the Western Business Coalition. In a letter to MPs, they're asking Ottawa to abandon oil and gas emission caps, lower taxes, and remove red tape. One business leader says if Ottawa does move on those issues, it could quell some of the frustration that's fueling the Western cessation talk.
I'm hopeful that if the federal government has seen the light about the importance of the economy and rising rather than falling living standards, that at least is a good opening to a conversation with Western Canada.
The official agenda says the premiers will talk about trade, tariffs, energy security, and Arctic sovereignty, but Western separatism will be the elephant in the room. Katie DeRosa, CBC News, Victoria.
The spring sitting of the Nunavut Legislative Assembly starts on Thursday, and there's a lot on the agenda. It's expected to last until June 3rd. Nunavut's government House leader says 5 government bills and 1 spending bill will be presented during the sitting.
The sponsoring ministers will be introducing 5 bills. Minister of Languages has 1. Minister of Justice has a couple, and then Health has additional bills to present as well. The money bill will be a supplementary appropriation capital, so the details will also be presented when it's tabled in the House.
Johannessi says he hopes bills that are currently before the Standing Committee on Legislation will be dealt with this sitting. One of those is the Pharmacy Professions Act. The chair of the committee says the bill is complex, but an MLA on the committee says he doesn't expect the bill to be difficult to review.
I don't recall seeing anything controversial. I think it's just making sure that we do our due diligence and make sure that the legislation is, appropriate for Nunavut as normal. But just offhand, I'm sorry, I don't recall exactly where that communication status is.
The legislature is also expected to deal with a report from Canada's Auditor General about public housing. That report will be presented on Monday. A new report says diamond mining brought more than $104 million in revenue to NWT Indigenous Development Corporations in 2023. It also created 355 jobs for local Indigenous people. The mines are facing an uncertain future, and as Nadir Hashmi reports, some Indigenous businesses are warning of the impact the closures could have on local communities.
The report was done by economist Graham Clinton. He concluded that jobs, both directly and indirectly related to diamond mining, generated nearly $40 million in income for Indigenous workers. These jobs were spread across Kl'icho and Yellowknife Dene First Nation communities.
I mean, it's alarming.
That's Paul Gruner, CEO of Kl'icho Investment Corporation, one of 3 Indigenous corporations which commissioned the report. He says with all 3 Northwest Territories diamond mines approaching closure, the financial hit could be huge.
It's kind of like having a 3-legged stool. If you remove one of those legs, how do you now overcome major revenue line item and employment?
Gruner says the report is a call to action for both territorial and federal governments.
It puts a face to it. It's not just a line item. These are very real people, families that put food on their table every day.
Leanne Poulter is the CEO of Denisolee Dene Corporation, the economic arm of Little Dene First Nation. She says her community has already suffered greatly at the hands of its former CEO, Ron Barlas. A judge found he funded millions of dollars from the Denisolee Dene Corporation.
The outlook isn't great for this community in particular.
Without new avenues to replace the mining industry, Poulter fears the future may be bleak. Nadir Hashmi, CBC News, Yellowknife.
To the Yukon now, where customers of Dawson City's only pharmacy are frustrated. Some residents say service is declining and it's letting people down in their time of need. There are few communities outside of Whitehorse that have a pharmacy. Dawson's is in the town's hospital and it's privately owned and managed by a pharmacist in Vancouver. Chris McIntyre has the details.
Staff shortages, long lineups, and even longer wait times for prescriptions to get filled. These are just a few things that people here in Dawson have to deal with on a regular basis. One resident says she was forced to wait over 3 weeks for her migraine medication. Kayla Goodwin says at first, staff said they'd call her when the prescription was filled, but nobody called. Goodwin went in to ask about her medication only to find out the pharmacy was closed when it was supposed to be opened. When the pharmacy finally opened up again, Goodwin says she was shocked by what the staff told her.
And they had said, oh yeah, we've had this prescription filled and waiting for you since April 30th. And I was a little surprised by that because they said they would call me, and I've also been in since April 30th and they said it wasn't ready. So I'm still waiting on one medication, but that's where I'm at.
Dawson resident Bipin Kothyari says he understands the pressure the small pharmacy is under when serving the community. He also says a pharmacy should adapt to keep a consistent standard of care, especially when it comes to providing vital medicine in a timely manner.
When you're serving a certain community which is remote and which relies heavily on healthcare, they have to ensure that they have a good backup plan.
The pharmacy here is owned by PharmaSave and managed by a pharmacist in Vancouver. CBC News repeatedly reached out for comment but did not get a reply. Chris McIntyre, CBC News, Dawson City.
A lockdown will continue in Lower Post, BC, following a community meeting on Tuesday night. The meeting was called over a rise in drugs and violence. About 30 people attended, as well as 2 RCMP members from the Watson Lake Detachment. The lockdown began last Friday in the small northern BC community. Citizens have been patrolling between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. They say there's been threats of gun violence from alleged drug dealers. Deludena Council members heard about work to create a long-term community policing program.
You are accountable for the safety of your community. And what are the consequences of not having accountability as individuals in our community? What are the consequences? We see it. We see the drugs and the violence coming into our community, and it's getting worse. It's not getting better right now, that's for sure.
Only one member spoke out against the lockdown patrols, saying it does more harm by pointing fingers at fellow Casca people. The RCMP say it's working with support agencies in Yukon and BC to provide more healing measures. They say it'll tackle addictions rather than arresting and charging those who use alcohol and drugs. In Nunavut, Kingite is taking action against an increase in vandalism. The hamlet says it's seen more break-ins and property damage this spring. Incidents include broken windows, damaged vehicles, and a recent break-in at the co-op warehouse. Kingite's mayor says the hamlet is working to hire a night watch to keep the streets safe overnight.
Spring is coming. It's not so cold. More kids will be out, and we, as Hamlet, we want to be prepared to make sure that we don't want nobody getting hurt. So hopefully, once we get the night watchman, that should help our community.
The hamlet also plans to meet with local stores and the RCMP before the end of the month to discuss how to tackle the issue together. And in Yellowknife, a 36-year-old man is facing charges after an apparent armed robbery on Old Airport Road. RCMP say the man is accused of robbing a business at Knife Point last week. Police say just before noon on Friday, they got a call about the robbery. The caller reported that a man had threatened staff with a knife, taken merchandise, and fled on foot. RCMP say a police dog tracked down the suspect. They've charged Frankie Iakfo with extortion without a firearm. He remains in custody. Whitehorse is working to set rules for development within the city. It's collecting public input about its new zoning bylaw. Right now, it's in the draft stage. The updates are meant to help the city reach a few goals, including increasing housing construction. Changes include building more units in urban residential zones and changes to building heights. And for the first time, the city is setting rules for short-term tenants, short-term rentals, proposing to limit them to primary dwellings.
So that could either be in their own home while they're away. So that's kind of like the traditional home sharing model. Or if they have a living or garden suite on the same property, that they could use that as a full-time short-term rental.
The city says what it doesn't want to allow in residential zones is people using an entire home as a short-term rental full-time. The city plans to host a number of open houses to get public feedback on the new zoning bylaw. Canada Post has presented its latest contract proposal to the union, representing 55,000 workers. It comes with postal employees poised to hit the picket lines on Friday, their second strike in less than 6 months. Marina von Stackelberg reports.
Canada Post presented its employees with a new contract offer just days before the Canadian Union of Postal Workers is set to walk off the job. The union says it offered to hold off on its strike for 2 weeks to take time to look over this new proposal. But under the Labor Code, both sides have to agree to a pause. Canada Post won't. The corporation says after 2 years of negotiations, a resolution is urgently needed, and that delaying a deal longer isn't in anyone's interests. But the union questions the corporation's timing.
What we're saying is why didn't they give us this offer in December? Why didn't they give it to us last week? They say they have an offer for us, and they put it right up against the deadline.
Canada Post's latest offer includes a wage increase of close to 14% over the next 4 years, plus 6 additional personal days. One of the big items the two sides are at odds over is expanding delivery schedules, including on weekends. Canada Post says to compete with private companies like Amazon, it needs to deliver 7 days a week. It wants to hire part-time staff to do that. The union wants full-time employees on those shifts, but the company says it needs more flexibility.
It's really about, do we continue to try and preserve the status quo? Or do we just say it's 2025, the delivery world has changed, we're part of the delivery world, so we need to change as well.
Canada Post has warned it can't sustain itself much longer with its current business model. The Crown Corporation is effectively bankrupt. Since 2018, it's bled more than $3 billion. Earlier this year, the federal government bailed Canada Post out with a $1 billion loan because it had run out of money to keep operating. Marina von Stackelberg, CBC News, Ottawa.
Top financial officials from G7 countries are in Banff, Alberta for a 3-day summit. They're in closed-door meetings to discuss the global economy, artificial intelligence, and the war in Ukraine. Anis Haidari is there.
Canada's finance minister is meeting his counterparts from the other G7 nations as finance ministers and central bankers from those nations come here to the Rocky Mountains. It's day 2 of their meetings here in Banff, and the formal agenda includes issues ranging from artificial intelligence impact on the economy to fighting financial crime to global trade stability. But of course, along with the many sessions that will look at global trade, broadly speaking, they will be talking about tariffs, even though those are not officially on the agenda. The U.S. is represented here. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is attending, and that's something past finance ministers say is a major plus for Canada.
I think it's a good thing that the Treasury Secretary is there, as well as the Chairman of the Federal Reserve. These are two of the people that we need to rely upon in Washington.
And in addition to the official agenda, expect many one-on-one meetings between Canadian officials and their counterparts from other countries, including the United States. Canada's finance minister is relatively new to his role, having only taken it on a few months ago. He is newer in that role than many of his counterparts here. In some cases, he'll be meeting some of them for the first time. Anis Haidari, CBC News, Banff.
The Prime Minister's office has confirmed that Canada is in talks to take part in U.S. President Donald Trump's proposed Golden Dome missile defense shield. Discussions include strengthening NORAD and related initiatives like the Golden Dome. Trump says the system will intercept missiles launched from anywhere, even those from space. Trump says the complex, multi-layered system will cost $175 billion, and it'll be completed within his term, which ends in 2029. The U.S. president says Canada will pay its fair share of the costs. Indigenous leaders in Canada are calling on Pope Leo to return thousands of sacred artifacts. Items like pipes, medicine bundles, and ceremonial regalia are currently housed in the Vatican Museum. They were taken from communities during the residential school era. Alexander Silberman has that story.
Cindy Woodhouse-Nepanak can only view these pieces of Indigenous history as photos. A rare Western Arctic kayak, Cree embroidered gloves, all among the vast collection stored behind the Vatican's walls.
They need to return it. I think that's a big signal from the church if they do.
The national chief of the Assembly of First Nations is renewing the fight to return these objects to Canada, calling on newly elected Pope Leo to commit to the repatriation of the artifacts.
I think this would be huge, monumental, a big piece of righting the wrongs of the past.
In 2022, a delegation of Indigenous leaders traveled to the Vatican to meet with Pope Francis. Church officials also gave them a private tour of some of the artifacts. At the time, Francis promised Indigenous items would be returned to their home communities.
When you bring back these objects, it will awaken people.
This Cree museum curator says colonization removed identity, and repatriation helps restore lost culture.
We need that more in these days because our languages and our cultures, they're very much threatened.
Catholic missionaries sent thousands of artifacts to Rome in the early 1900s. It's unclear how many are from Canada and how they came to be in the church's possession. The Vatican says they were gifts, but Indigenous leaders refute that narrative.
That's the call out right now is work with First Nations, work with the residential school survivors to give those back to the rightful owners.
Indigenous leaders say they're optimistic newly elected Pope Leo will uphold the promise of his predecessor, but plan to continue pressing for their precious cultural belongings to be returned home. Alexander Silberman, CBC News, Regina.
The Rankin Inlet Fishing Derby will rename itself after a late hunter and fisher from the community. The new name will honor the late Remy Nokitok. Organizers have been looking for a new name since last year. Nokitok's family submitted their late father's name. They say he was a good hunter and fisher who promoted on-the-land activities. For the Derby's committee, taking Nokitok's name made sense.
He was known for being a kind person, also for being a good fisher and hunter. He was always trying to do well. That is the reason why they wanted to name the Derby after him, and we all agreed.
The official name will now be the Remy Nokitok Trout Fishing Derby. Now let's take a look at your weather. And that is Northbeat for tonight. For news anytime, go to cbc.ca/north. Thank you for watching. I'm Megan Roberts. Have a good night.